When we hear the word Viking, the image arrives instantly. A towering warrior, wind in his beard, a weapon raised high, a ship cutting through icy waves toward an unsuspecting shore. It is a powerful image. It is also wildly misleading. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Whether you're listening late at night, studying, relaxing, or simply letting history play quietly in the background, you're very welcome here. If you feel like it, scroll down and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's step back in time to the everyday world of the Vikings. If you had lived during the Viking Age, roughly between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, the chances that you spent your days raiding monasteries were very small. Far more likely, you spent your days staring at soil, clouds, livestock, and people you were related to in at least 3 different ways. This is the first reality of Viking life that modern storytelling rarely lingers on. Most Vikings were not warriors, they were farmers. And farming, despite its many virtues, does not lend itself easily to dramatic slow-motion scenes. Viking society was built not around conquest, but around survival. The Scandinavian landscape was harsh, unpredictable. Winters were long and dark. Summers were short and frantic. The margin for error was thin, and mistakes were remembered for generations, usually because they resulted in hunger. As a result, Viking communities were small, rural, and deeply interconnected. Villages were not bustling cities. They were clusters of longhouses, farms, and outbuildings, often centered around a few extended families who had been living together for decades, sometimes centuries. You did not choose your neighbors, you inherited them. And once you were part of a community, there was no real way to opt out. Survival required cooperation. If one household failed to plant, harvest, or store enough food, others would feel the consequences. If someone refused to help, they were remembered, and not fondly. This was not a culture built on individualism. It was built on obligation. Families were large, multi-generational, and tightly bound. A single household often included parents, children, grandparents, and relatives, whose exact relationship had long since stopped being clarified. Everyone worked, everyone contributed, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy was not a cultural value. It was a structural impossibility. Adding to this social structure were thralls, enslaved individuals who formed the lowest rung of Viking society. Thralls were acquired through warfare, raids, or trade, and they performed the hardest and least desirable labor, however. And this is important. Viking slavery was not always permanent. Thralls could sometimes buy their freedom, be freed by their owners, or gain status through long service. This did not make slavery humane, but it did make it fluid in a way many later systems were not. The average Viking lived in a world where social hierarchy was clear, visible, and enforced, but also local and personal. You knew exactly where you stood because everyone around you reminded you. Life itself was structured around the seasons. There were no clocks, no calendars hanging on walls. Time was measured by daylight, weather, and memory. Spring meant planting. Summer meant tending, repairing, and trading. Autumn meant harvesting and preparing. Winter meant enduring. Each season came with its own rhythms and anxieties. A poor summer could haunt a community for years. A harsh winter could erase generations. Planning was not optional. It was existential. Children grew up quickly in this environment. From a young age, they learned that work was not something you eventually did. It was something you always did. Childhood was not a protected phase. It was training. And yet, for all its hardship, Viking society was not chaotic. Law existed. Order existed. But it did not come from distant rulers or centralized governments. It came from the community itself. Kings existed, yes, but their power was limited. Real authority was local. Disputes were settled face to face. Reputation mattered more than titles. If you were known as fair, reliable, and honorable, your word carried weight. If you were known as selfish or reckless, you found yourself increasingly alone. And loneliness in a Viking village was dangerous. This is where the Viking reputation for violence often gets misunderstood. Yes, violence existed. Yes, feuds happened. Yes, people died violently, but violence was not random. It was regulated, constrained, and often avoided when possible. Not because Vikings were peaceful, but because violence destabilized the fragile balance of survival. A dead farmer produced no food. A dead craftsman made no tools. A dead neighbor left fewer hands for winter. As a result, conflict was often handled through negotiation, compensation, and public judgment. Systems designed to keep bloodshed from spiraling out of control. In many ways, Viking society was pragmatic to the point of emotional exhaustion, which brings us to their homes. The longhouse was the physical center of Viking life. Longhouses were long, narrow buildings constructed from timber, stone, and turf. They were designed not to impress, but to endure. The roofs were layered with sod, living grass, which provided insulation and helped anchor the structure against powerful winds. From a distance, a village could appear to rise organically from the land itself, blending into the hills and fields inside. Everything revolved around the hearth. This central fire provided warmth, light, and food. It burned almost constantly. Smoke drifted upward and escaped through a hole in the roof, at least in theory. In practice, Viking interiors were often smoky, dim, and perpetually scented with ash. This was not accidental. Smoke helped preserve the wooden structure and keep insects away. It also slowly cured hanging meats and fish. Viking lungs Unfortunately, where collateral damage, furniture was sparse and functional. Benches lined the walls and doubled as beds. Chests stored clothing, tools, and personal belongings. There were no separate rooms, no hallways, no doors to close when you wanted to be alone, because you never were during winter. Animals were often brought inside. Sheep, goats, and sometimes cattle shared the living space with humans, contributing warmth, noise, and atmosphere. The Viking home was not clean by modern standards, but it was warm. And in the north, warmth mattered more than almost anything else. Food, unsurprisingly, dominated much of daily thought. The Viking diet was repetitive, seasonal, and deeply dependent on preservation. Grains like barley and rye were staples, ground into coarse flour and baked into dense, heavy bread. This bread was filling, durable, and capable of surviving long storage. Though not, it must be said, particularly enjoyable, meat was valuable and not eaten daily. Livestock represented wealth, labor, and future survival. Slaughtering an animal was a serious decision, usually reserved for festivals, celebrations, or times of necessity. Fish, on the other hand, was abundant. Fresh fish in summer, dried or salted fish in winter, fish for breakfast, fish for dinner, fish for the rest of your life. Dairy products were essential. Milk, butter, cheese, and fermented foods like skyr provided calories, protein, and fat. Vegetables such as cabbage, onions, peas, and beans added variety when available. Wild berries and herbs were gathered eagerly during warmer months, and honey was treasured as the only reliable sweetener. Meals were communal. Everyone ate together, sharing food from common dishes. There was no menu. There were no preferences. There was food, or there wasn't. Complaining was not productive, despite the harshness of daily life. Vikings were not indifferent to comfort or appearance. Clothing was handmade, crafted from wool and linen. Natural dyes produced blues, reds, yellows, and greens, muted by necessity, but carefully chosen. Jewelry served not just as decoration, but as markers of identity, family ties, and status. And contrary to popular belief, Vikings cared deeply about cleanliness. They bathed weekly, a habit that astonished and unsettled many of their European neighbors. Combs were common personal items. Hair and beards were groomed. Looking respectable mattered, partly because reputation mattered, and partly because when you live in close quarters with dozens of people and several animals, hygiene becomes a survival strategy. Religion threaded quietly through every part of life. The Viking gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were present, flawed, and deeply involved in human affairs. Odin sought wisdom at any cost. Thor defended order against chaos. Frey and Freyja governed fertility, prosperity, and love. These gods were not moral paragons. They were powerful forces to be respected, negotiated with, and occasionally blamed. Fate, known as Weird, was inescapable. You could act bravely, wisely, or foolishly, but the outcome was already woven. This belief did not make Vikings passive. It made them focused on how they faced what was coming. Valhalla awaited fallen warriors, but most Vikings did not expect heroic deaths. They expected to live, work, age, and die within the same community that had known them since birth. And they hoped, above all, to be remembered, because memory was legacy, stories preserved identity. Reputation outlived the body. A good name could echo through generations. A bad one could haunt a family forever. This was the true foundation of Viking life, not conquest, not glory, but endurance. And in the next part, we will step deeper into the physical reality of that endurance, into the longhouse, the fields, the weather, and the relentless daily grind that defined what it meant to be alive in the Viking world. If Viking life had a single defining feature, it was not violence. It was repetition, day after day, season after season, the same tasks, the same worries, the same calculations about whether there would be enough. At the center of this repetition stood the home, the longhouse, not as a place of rest, but as a place of constant activity. The longhouse was never quiet. From the moment the fire was stirred in the morning to the moment it was banked at night, footsteps on packed earth, tools scraping wood, voices speaking over one another, children moving constantly, animals shifting, snorting, and reminding everyone that they were very much present. The longhouse was built for survival, not comfort, and certainly not silence. Its walls were thick, layered with wood, stone, and turf. These materials helped trap heat, but they also trapped smells. Smoke, sweat, damp wool, cooked fish, animal waste, and human breath blended into a scent that no Viking ever questioned, because it was simply the smell of life. The hearth burned at the center, low and wide. Flames flickered across darkened rafters, leaving blackened beams that testified to generations of fire. There was no chimney. Smoke drifted upward and escaped through a hole in the roof. Eventually, until then, it lingered. This smoke served a purpose. It discouraged insects. It preserved wood. It cured meat hanging from beams. It also ensured that nearly everyone coughed occasionally, especially when the fire flared. Vikings did not romanticize this. They accepted it. Light inside the longhouse was limited. During the day, the doorway and roof opening provided dim illumination. At night, the fire and small oil lamps cast flickering shadows. Faces were often half-lit. Corners disappeared into darkness. It was in this environment that most of life unfolded. Benches lined the walls, serving as seating by day and beds by night. There were no mattresses, only straw-filled sacks, animal skins, and wool blankets. Sleep was communal. Children slept near parents. Elders slept where it was warmest. Privacy was not requested. It was unimaginable. Personal belongings were stored in wooden chests. Clothing, tools, jewelry, keepsakes. Everything you owned could be packed up quickly. A necessity in a world where fire, flood, or feud could force sudden movement. During winter, animals were brought inside. This was not a sentimental choice. It was practical. Livestock represented wealth, labor, and food. Keeping them alive through winter mattered. Their body heat warmed the space. Their presence, while loud and occasionally unpleasant, was tolerated. Sheep shifted. Goats tested boundaries. Cattle breathed heavily in the dark. The line between human and animal life blurred, not philosophically, but physically. And outside the longhouse, the environment offered no mercy. Weather dominated everything. Scandinavian winters were long, cold, and dark. Daylight shrank to few weak hours. Snow covered fields. Ice locked waterways. Travel slowed or stopped entirely. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Winter was endured, not enjoyed. Food stores were checked constantly. Grain bins, dried fish, smoked meat, preserved dairy. All were counted and recounted. A miscalculation could mean hunger. Hunger weakened bodies. Weak bodies struggled to survive illness. This was not paranoia. It was experience. Summer, by contrast, was frantic. When daylight returned, it lingered. Long summer days allowed work to stretch late into the evening. Every hour mattered. Fields had to be prepared, planted, tended, and protected. Repairs delayed during winter had to be completed quickly. Boats were checked. Tools were sharpened. There was no concept of taking it easy. The rhythm of daily labor was exhausting, but familiar. Morning began early. Fires were stirred. Food was prepared, often leftover bread, dairy, or fish. There was no breakfast as a concept. There was food, eaten when time allowed. Work followed immediately. Men, women, and children all contributed. Gender roles existed, but they were practical rather than rigid. Strength determined some tasks. Skill determined others. Necessity overruled ideology. Fields were worked by hand. Soil was stubborn. Tools were simple. Progress was slow. Weeding, planting, harvesting. Each required patience and endurance. Fishing was constant for coastal communities. Nets were repaired endlessly. Boats were launched carefully. Weather was watched obsessively. The sea provided abundance and took lives without apology. Food preservation was an art form. Fish were dried on racks, salted heavily, or smoked. Meat was cured slowly. Dairy was fermented. Vegetables were stored in cool, dark places. Every method aimed at one goal: making food last. Fresh food was a luxury measured in days, not months. Meals were eaten communally, often from shared bowls. Wooden spoons, knives, and hands were used interchangeably. Food was filling rather than flavorful. Spices were rare. Hunger was persuasive. No one expected variety. They expected enough. Hunger shaped psychology. It made people cautious. It made people practical. It made people suspicious of waste. Throwing food away was unthinkable. Leftovers were reused. Bones were cracked for marrow. Nothing edible was discarded lightly. And when food was plentiful, during feasts or festivals, it was celebrated enthusiastically. Not because Vikings were indulgent, but because abundance was temporary. Clothing, too, reflected this practical mindset. Everything was handmade. Wool was spun, woven, and sewn at home. Linen required extensive labor to produce. Clothing took time, effort, and skill, which meant it was valued. Garments were repaired repeatedly. Patches were expected. Worn clothing was not shameful. It was evidence of use. Natural dyes produced colors that faded over time, softening into muted tones. Brightness was not the goal. Durability was. Shoes were leather, stitched by hand. They wore out quickly in mud and snow. Replacement was constant. Bare feet in winter were not an option. Despite the hardship, Vikings cared about appearance. Hair was combed. Beards were trimmed. Jewelry was worn daily, not saved for special occasions. Appearance signaled self-respect and respect for others. This attention to grooming surprised many outsiders. In a medieval world where bathing was often avoided, Vikings bathed weekly. They washed, groomed, and maintained themselves, partly because they wanted to, and partly because living closely with others made neglect noticeable. Religion quietly framed daily life. Gods were not distant beings, consulted only in crisis. They were part of everyday thinking. A good harvest was gratitude-worthy. A bad storm required explanation. Fortune and misfortune were interpreted through divine influence. Small offerings were made. Words were spoken. Rituals were observed, not out of blind devotion, but out of habit and caution. Better to stay on good terms with forces you could not control. As the day wore on, labor continued until light faded or exhaustion won. Tools were stored. Animals were settled. Fires were tended. Evenings brought a shift in pace. People gathered near the hearth. Food was eaten again, if available. Stories were told. News was shared. Disputes were aired quietly or postponed. Children listened, absorbing lessons without realizing it. Storytelling was entertainment, education, and memory preservation all at once. These moments mattered. They were not dramatic. They were grounding, because tomorrow would be much the same. And the day after that. This repetition was not dull to Vikings. It was stability. In a world where illness could arrive suddenly, storms could destroy months of work, and death was always nearby. Predictability was comfort. The longhouse was not just shelter, it was continuity. And in the next part, we will step deeper into the social fabric that held Viking life together, examining work, trade, status, gender roles, childhood, aging, and what it truly meant to have value in a world where survival was the measure of worth. In the Viking world, Worth was not an abstract idea. It was not measured by ambition, potential, or intention. It was measured by contribution, what you could produce, what you could protect, what you could endure. Every person, from childhood onward, existed within this quiet calculation. Work was not a phase of life. It was life, from the moment a child could walk steadily. At first, this meant observation, watching adults work, listening to instructions repeated endlessly, absorbing expectations without ceremony. Soon after, it meant participation. Children fetched water, tended animals, collected firewood, watched younger siblings, and carried tools. There was no formal age of responsibility. You worked when you were capable, and capability was noticed quickly. This was not cruelty, it was necessity. In a society without surplus labor, every pair of hands mattered. Gender roles existed, but they were rooted in practicality rather than ideology. Men and women performed different tasks, but both were essential, and neither was optional. Men generally handled heavy agricultural labor, fishing, hunting, shipbuilding, and long-distance trade. Women managed households, processed food, made clothing, oversaw domestic production, and often managed farms in their husbands' absence. This division was flexible. If a task needed doing, it was done. Women held significant authority within the household. They controlled keys, literal symbols of responsibility, representing access to food stores, valuables, and supplies. They made daily decisions that determined whether a household thrived or failed. Marriage was not romanticized. It was practical. Unions were arranged to strengthen families, secure alliances, and ensure stability. Love could grow, but it was not the primary consideration. Survival was, yet women were not powerless. They could own property, initiate divorce, and reclaim dowries. In a medieval context, this was remarkable. Men, meanwhile, were judged heavily by reputation. Honor mattered. Reliability mattered. Being known as someone who showed up, fulfilled obligations, and did not create unnecessary conflict was invaluable. A man who caused trouble was not admired. He was tolerated until he wasn't. Trades and crafts shaped social standing. Blacksmiths were among the most respected members of society. They transformed raw materials into tools, weapons, and household goods. Without them, farming slowed, ships failed, and defense weakened. Shipbuilders held similar importance. Longships were technological marvels, lightweight, flexible, and fast. They allowed Vikings to fish, trade, raid, and explore. Shipbuilders understood wood, balance, and water in ways few others did. Craftspeople produced jewelry, tools, clothing accessories, and decorative items. These objects were not frivolous. They signaled identity, family, and success. Trade extended Viking influence far beyond Scandinavia, while raids captured attention. Trade sustained communities. Viking merchants traveled across Europe, into the Middle East and along river systems deep into continental interiors. They traded furs, amber, iron, and crafted goods in exchange for silver, spices, textiles, and ideas. Trade brought wealth, but also exposure, new customs, new beliefs, new tensions. Not every Viking welcomed these changes. Tradition was comfort. Innovation was risk. Still, curiosity persisted. Status in Viking society was visible, but fluid. Free individuals ranked above thralls, landowners above laborers, skilled craftspeople above unskilled workers. Wealth mattered, but reputation mattered more. A respected person could rise. A dishonorable one could fall. Elders occupied a complicated position. Those who survived into old age were respected for their experience and memory. They advised, mediated disputes, and preserved tradition. But aging also brought vulnerability. If an elder could no longer contribute, care depended on family loyalty and resources. There were no institutions, no guarantees. Care was personal, and sometimes fragile disability and injury were common. Work was physical. Tools were simple. Accidents happened. A broken limb could change a life permanently. Those injured relied on family and community support. When available, compassion existed, but survival always came first. Value was not about moral worth. It was about usefulness. This calculation extended even into law. Disputes were settled at assemblies called things, gatherings that combined legal proceedings, political discussion, and social reinforcement. Laws were spoken aloud by memory, not written. Everyone present heard the same words. Honor disputes were common. Insults could escalate quickly, but violence was not encouraged. It was controlled. Compensation often replaced revenge. Payments were negotiated. Lives had monetary value assigned, not because Vikings were cold, but because endless feuds were destructive. Exile was among the harshest punishments. To be cast out of your community was to lose protection, support, and identity. Alone, survival was uncertain. Exile was not dramatic. It was slow erasure through all of this. Community remained central. Feasts marked success. Weddings reinforced alliances. Funerals honored memory. These gatherings reminded everyone that survival was collective. And beneath every interaction ran the awareness that nothing was guaranteed. Food could fail. Weather could turn. Health could vanish. Work was constant because uncertainty was constant. In the Viking world, meaning did not come from personal fulfillment. It came from endurance. And in the next part, we will explore how Vikings understood forces beyond endurance. Their gods, their laws, their beliefs about fate, illness, conflict, death, and what awaited them beyond this life. For the Vikings, the world was not random. It was unpredictable. Yes, often cruel, occasionally generous, but never meaningless. Everything that happened, good harvests, sudden storms, illness, fortune. To live without acknowledging these forces would have seemed reckless. The gods were not distant beings watching from the sky. They were participants. Odin, the god of wisdom, war, and sacrifice, was admired, but also feared. He was not kind. He was clever. He valued knowledge gained at great cost, and his followers understood that wisdom often required loss. Thor, protector of humanity, was far more approachable. He battled chaos, defended order, and wielded thunder as both weapon and warning. When storms rolled in, Thor was present. Whether welcomed or not, Frey and Freyja governed fertility, prosperity, love, and continuity. They mattered deeply in a society dependent on crops, animals, and family growth. The gods were not moral instructors. They were powerful personalities. Vikings did not ask whether the gods were good. They asked whether the gods were satisfied. Rituals were woven quietly into life. Seasonal festivals marked transitions. Offerings were made, sometimes food, sometimes animals, sometimes objects of value. These acts were not dramatic spectacles. They were cautious negotiations. Better to give something small than risk divine displeasure. Fate, Weird, governed all things. This belief shaped Viking psychology profoundly. Fate could not be avoided, only met. Courage was not about changing outcomes, but about facing them with dignity. This belief did not encourage recklessness. It encouraged acceptance. Law reflected this worldview. Disputes were addressed at things, where laws were spoken aloud from memory. Justice was public. Everyone heard the arguments. Everyone witnessed the outcome. There were no prisons. Punishment focused on restoration or removal. Compensation was common. Honor could be repaired. Violence was regulated. Blood feuds existed, but they were costly and discouraged. A feud destabilized entire communities. Exile, once again, was the ultimate sentence. To be exiled was to be cut off from society, from protection, trade, family, and memory. Alone, survival was uncertain. Exile was not swift. It was lonely. Health and medicine existed in a space between belief and observation. Illness was common. Injury was expected. Medicine relied on herbs, experience, and tradition. Healers used plants, salves, and rituals. Some treatments helped. Some did nothing. Some made things worse. There was no anesthesia. Pain was endured. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died young. Many infants did not survive. These losses were grieved, but they were also expected. Death was not hidden. Bodies were prepared carefully. Funerals reflected status. Some were buried with tools, weapons, or jewelry. Others were cremated, their remains honored through ritual. Funeral rites were not only about the dead, they were about the living. Memory mattered. To be remembered was to endure. Stories preserved identity. Names carried weight. Reputation outlived the body. Death was not the end of participation. in the world. The dead influenced the living through memory, tradition, and example. This acceptance of mortality shaped daily behavior. Vikings did not fear death constantly. They respected it. Life was lived fully because it was finite. Work mattered because time was limited. The world was harsh, but it was coherent. And through belief, law, and ritual, Vikings made sense of it in the final part. We will explore the outward-facing side of Viking life. Travel, exploration, storytelling, and the legacy that continues to shape how we remember them today. For all the rootedness of Viking life, the farms, the fields, the longhouses, there was always a pull outward, a horizon that invited curiosity, a shoreline that promised possibility, a sense that the world was larger than any single village could contain. This tension between staying and leaving shaped the Viking spirit as much as survival itself. Vikings were extraordinary sailors, not because they loved danger. Scandinavia is a land carved by fjords, rivers, and coastlines. Boats were not luxuries. They were necessities. The longship was the result of generations of quiet innovation. Light enough to carry over land, strong enough to cross open seas, flexible enough to survive heavy waves. Its shallow draft allowed it to travel rivers deep inland. These ships were not built for comfort. They were built for purpose. Sailing was communal work. Rowing required coordination. Navigation required attention. The sea did not forgive distraction. Vikings navigated by sun, stars, wind, landmarks, and experience. Some may have used sunstones, crystals that helped locate sunlight through clouds. But even without them, navigation relied heavily on memory and instinct. Storms were feared. Waves were respected. The sea provided food, wealth, and travel, and took lives without apology. Exploration emerged not from ambition, but from pressure. Land was limited. Resources were finite. Younger generations often had fewer opportunities at home. Travel offered release and risk. This is how Vikings reached Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. Not through grand plans, but through gradual extension. One voyage led to another. One story encouraged the next attempt. These journeys were not heroic epics at the time. They were survival strategies. Travel changed Vikings. They encountered new cultures, beliefs, technologies, and systems. They traded, settled, intermarried, and adapted. They were not isolated barbarians. They were participants in a vast, interconnected world. And when travelers returned, they brought more than goods. They brought stories. Storytelling was the backbone of Viking memory. In a world without widespread literacy, history lived in voices. Skalds, poets, and storytellers preserved events, values, and lineage through carefully crafted verses. Stories were not purely factual. They were meaningful. Details shifted. Emphasis changed. Lessons mattered more than precision. Sagas preserved identity. They taught courage, restraint, loyalty, and consequence. They reminded listeners who they were and who they should be. Storytelling happened at night, near the hearth. The fire crackled, shadows danced, voices lowered. Children listened quietly, absorbing history without realizing it. These stories were not entertainment alone. They were inheritance, games, music, and simple sports filled communal time. These moments of play balanced labor. They reminded people they were more than tools of survival. And yet, always beneath these moments, there remained an understanding. Nothing lasts forever. Viking society changed. Christianity spread. Trade routes shifted. Political structures evolved. The Viking Age faded, not in collapse, but in transformation. What remains today is not the daily grind, but the legend. We remember the raids, not the harvests, the battles, not the winters, the ships, not the smoke-filled longhouses, but the truth of Viking life lived in the quiet moments, in shared labor, careful planning, and enduring hardship together. They were not extraordinary because they conquered. They were extraordinary because they survived. They built meaning in repetition. They found identity in community. They accepted fate without surrender. And perhaps that is why their stories endure, because beneath the armor and mythology, Viking life was deeply human, uncertain, communal, and resilient. A life not so different from our own, just colder, darker, and significantly more uncomfortable. To understand Viking life fully, crops could fail despite careful planning. Livestock could fall ill. A single injury could end someone's ability to work. Illness could spread quietly through a household before anyone understood what was happening. There was no safety net, no stored abundance large enough to ignore loss. This constant uncertainty shaped the Viking mind deeply. Planning was not optimistic. It was cautious. Expectations were tempered. People learned not to assume success, but to prepare for disappointment. Hope existed, but it was practical, restrained, and always paired with effort. This was not pessimism. It was realism. Fear existed, but it was not dramatic. It did not announce itself loudly. It lived quietly beneath routine, in the checking of food stores, the watching of the sky, the careful handling of tools. Storms were feared, not because they were exciting, but because they destroyed work. Hunger was feared, not because it was painful, but because it weakened everyone at once. Exile was feared not because it was cruel, but because it erased identity. Courage in this world did not mean recklessness. It meant endurance, getting up every day, doing what needed to be done, continuing despite exhaustion, grief, or uncertainty. The Viking idea of bravery was not about charging forward. It was about not withdrawing. This mindset extended into relationships. Marriage, for example, was rarely romantic in the modern sense. It was built on shared responsibility, mutual survival, and trust. Affection existed, but it was often quiet, practical, and understated. Love was expressed through reliability, through presence, through work, parenting, carried a heavy emotional weight. Children were loved deeply, but cautiously. Infant mortality was high. Many parents did not allow themselves to fully relax until a child had survived several years. Even then, accidents and illness were constant threats. Loss was common. Grief was frequent. Yet grief did not paralyze life. It could not afford to. The dead were mourned, remembered, and honored. But the living still had fields to tend and animals to feed. Emotional resilience was not optional. It was learned early. Affection was shown through action rather than words. A repaired tool, a shared meal, a place by the fire, these gestures carried meaning far beyond sentiment. Viking life was also, quite often, monotonous. Days repeated themselves with remarkable consistency. The same tasks, the same routes, the same meals. To a modern mind, this might feel unbearable. To Vikings, it was reassuring. Routine reduced uncertainty. Predictability brought comfort. Knowing what tomorrow would require allowed the mind to rest, at least briefly. Excitement was not sought. Stability was. This is why periods of peace were valued, even if they lacked glory. A quiet year with no disasters was a successful year. Boredom, in this context, was not emptiness, it was safety. And yet, within this routine, meaning was found. Meaning came from usefulness. To be valuable was to contribute. To be needed was to belong. To know that your absence would be felt was deeply grounding. Identity was not self-defined. It was community confirmed. People understood themselves through their roles. Farmer, parent, craftsperson, storyteller, elder. These identities provided clarity. There was little confusion about purpose. Modern anxieties about self-discovery would have seemed indulgent. The Viking world did not ask who you wanted to be. It asked what you could do. Honor, in this context, was not abstract morality. It was reliability over time, keeping promises, showing restraint, acting predictably when it mattered. Reputation was fragile and permanent. One bad decision could echo for years. One act of generosity could define a legacy. Without written records, memory was everything. Stories were the archive. This awareness shaped behavior. People acted not only for themselves, but for how their actions would be remembered. Being spoken of well after death mattered profoundly. This is why storytelling held such power. Stories connected generations. They explained mistakes. They preserved lessons. They gave continuity to lives that were otherwise brief and physically demanding. Listening to stories by firelight was not escapism. It was grounding. It reminded listeners that others had faced similar fears and survived or failed, and that both outcomes held meaning. In this way, Viking life was deeply philosophical without being theoretical. There were no debates about the meaning of life. Life's meaning was assumed. You lived, you contributed, you endured, you were remembered, or not. And that was enough. As the Viking Age faded and societies changed, writing replaced memory. Institutions replaced community dependence. Distance grew between people and the forces that sustained them. But traces remain in the emphasis on resilience, in the respect for effort, in the quiet dignity of showing up, even when no one is watching. The Vikings were not exceptional because they conquered lands. They were exceptional because they built meaning in a world that offered little comfort. They accepted uncertainty without surrender. They faced hardship without spectacle. They lived fully within limits. And perhaps that is why their story continues to resonate. Because beneath the armor and legend, Viking life was not about domination. It was about endurance, and endurance quietly practiced